Radio check. Loud and clear.
KSL Sports and KSL Podcast present Mode Push, an American view of F1, starting now.
And I'm stuck. He's looking gut with his honestly.
I'm gutted. I'm absolutely gutted.
I enjoyed this so much. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, everybody, welcome on in. It's Mode Push, and it's been a minute. We're glad you're here with us. Being able to talk all things F1 on the program here. That's what we do on a mostly weekly basis. It's been quite a wild time of the year for Dan Jimenez and I both. And here we are, able to jam after a crazy triple header in a couple of weeks that we haven't been able to jump in on. But no big deal. We leave the pod for a couple of weeks, Dan, and Mercedes goes back-to-back wins. I know you had that on the bingo board, right?
It's the last thing any of us would have guessed. 2 weeks ago, you roll back and you're like, hey, guess what? Mercedes is going to win the next two races. I would have taken those odds all day. That's insane.
Yeah, I'm not sure where we are with the sport right now. What are we watching? I mean, obviously, weather was a factor last week. Strategies had to come into play both of the weeks as well. But, like, I mean, legitimately, well, you tell me, is Mercedes and McLaren and Red Bull, are they all kind of on very similar paces right now? And circuits thrown out the window, you know, notwithstanding, are they basically able to bring the fight, Mercedes that is, to McLaren and to Red Bull now every week? Is that what we're starting to figure out?
And McLaren for sure is taking it to Red Bull, and Mercedes has given us reason to believe, you know, George's win was a little fortuitous with what happened up front, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I mean, George was on the pole for Silverstone in dry conditions. Like they're fast. So yes, I think we have three teams under a blanket. Ferrari sadly has just gone backwards in a big way since Monaco, but this is awesome. Like I was looking up a stat that we have four different constructor wins in the first, I think, 12 races it is. And we haven't had that since like 2014. So, you know, in a way right now is the most competitive Formula One has been, I think, in what I would call like the Drive to Survive era, where we've got, you know, all these new fans. They've never seen as competitive this. Even the like 2021 Lewis Max, I mean, it was back and forth every other race between those two guys. But I think we have a third team in the mix now that is legitimately as fast as those front two. So I am so amped for the rest of the season, but particularly for next year. I think 2025 is going to be a banger year for Formula One because you're going to have three, hopefully 4 or 5 teams super close to each other and fighting. And yeah, Red Bull is, I think, completely lost their dominant advantage that made them an absolute like shoo-in for a win every week. I think it's now coming down to strategy more than ever, and individual driver talent, which is, I think, what makes for great racing.
So you're going to have a year. Okay, so basically a half a year, because we're halfway through the calendar now. A half a year of great racing this season. Full year of great racing next season. And then everything gets reset again for 2026.
Who knows?
And, you know, Alpine will be unbeatable for 2 seasons, just like we probably will have predicted. I look at where the last couple of weeks went. And it's weird not to see Max win for 2 weeks, right? It's weird not to see and I think it's weird for him to see somebody alongside him. I have this theory that Max is such a sore loser. Other people call it being a really competitive guy, but he really does. I think he has no problem taking somebody else out. If it means that if it's like, if I'm not going to win, no one's going to win. And certainly you're not going to win. And, you know, we always hear about these guys and who gets along on the grid and who doesn't and blah, blah, blah. And Max and Lando are as close as anybody, any racer that we know in F1, right? That's kind of the thing is that they're the closest buddies. They fly together on Max's jet because Lando's like, one of these days, maybe I'll get a jet. But it's a weird thing because then you had this back and forth, and for a moment you had both drivers pointing fingers at one another. I think we all definitively sort of saw what went on in the FIA, or I guess Formula One. The stewards actually concluded the same thing, and that is that Max was in the wrong. Of course, it didn't matter at that point because Lando's car got blitzed to bits, and Max ends up finishing fifth. That's how, of course, George Russell was able to get the win in Austria. But your thoughts on how that Austrian race kind of went down and how that dynamic of Max versus Lando versus the rest of the grid is going to work out now that everyone's starting to catch up?
Yeah, man, I love the first 50 laps of that race were actually pretty boring.
Yes.
And then then we had the last pit stop, and Max's team kind of flubbed the pit stop, and it gave hope. But even without the flub pit stop, I think just for some reason that McLaren seems to come alive in the last stint when it gets light on fuel. And yeah, Lando, I think, was racing him super clean. He dive bombed. I think he dive bombed him once. That was a little obviously too aggressive, which caused him to run wide and get that what was going to be the inevitable track limits penalty. But Max uses up every inch that is allowed under the rules and sometimes more. And I think what happened with the contact was, he had the inside, he took the inside line, but he was going to run Lando super wide. And you look at the replay, and he is all the way to the left and pinning Lando up against the curb, and he missed it by an inch.
Right?
1 inch off of it, and it would have been a clean, defensive move, and he wouldn't have gotten a penalty. And it was just weird how they touched that. It ended up cutting both of their tires. I was super surprised by it. I thought that initially it was obvious that Max was down a tire, and I thought Lando had maybe survived it and was going to get past them. But the post-race comments, I thought, like, holy cow, here we go. This is going to be Lewis and Nico, Rosberg levels of, just a rivalry between these two guys who up to this point have been super friendly. And, Max is kind of like, hey, good for you for getting that win kind of attitude. But I think that was kind of going away after that win, because he realizes that he isn't, clearly, going to win every single one of these battles, and that Lando is faster than him. So I think I hope that Lando keeps like the dog in him. I hope he keeps that fight. And, he was a little bit more like apologetic going into Silverstone, saying like, yeah, I kind of regret some of the things I said after the race. I'm like, dude, don't regret it. Like, you're fired up in the moment, like, for good reason. And I know that you'd still need to get a ride on, his jet, I guess. But like, we don't want to see you back down. We don't want you to be mean.
Do we know if they did actually fly back that weekend? That would have been one where you hitch a ride with, I don't know. Yeah. Helmet Marco. I'm trying to think of like a person you'd be super awkward with still, but
right. Yeah. Still a weird. Yeah.
I love how it's like, I don't know, which private jet do you think they took having come from Las Vegas and pulling into that airport, and you see about 100 private jets, and you're like, oh, everybody's got a private jet. I feel like in F1, that's exactly the case, but either way,
there's options. Yeah.
There have been some texts, I guess, back and forth. They chatted, they said they figured it out. And obviously, we don't know their personal relationship, but fine. It is what it is. It ended up making for a really, really nice chapter. The alternative was weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks with Max winning, and he's already up 80-something points in the championship at that point, and so it feels like it's a kind of an insurmountable lead. But unless McLaren actually did have the pace to start beating him every week, and from the constructor's standpoint, like Oscar Piastri is freaking fast, by the way. When he got on, was he on mediums there at the end of that race this last week? Because he started flying up the order. Like again, we say this, and I like that we're doing it because there's like a handful of races that we go, if there were 4 or 5 other laps left in that race, it would have been maybe a totally different podium.
Yeah, I think that in the most like probable alternate universe, Oscar won the last 2 races, because at Austria he would have started, third, I think, but he had his time disqualified for the stupid track limit stake. Mm-hmm. So he would have been in front of George and would have won that race. And then, last week he had this, they pit him too late. He was in the lead. They pit him 1 lap after, because they didn't want to double stack with Lando, and that screwed his race too. So it's, a lot of shoulda, woulda, couldas, but Oscar is every bit as fast as Lando right now, and he is going to get a win this year. Like, I'll put my name on that. He's going to win a race this year.
if you are to take the last two races and say this is definitively the new normal, what we're going to get the rest of the year, what would be the thing that you would say is going to be the new normal the rest of the year versus the stuff that we may just have been tricked on maybe one race to the next?
I think Red Bull and Max. We don't need to middle up Sergio.
Come on, we don't.
Max.
You're not even allowed to say his name anymore. He's not even in the top 15. I feel like.
Okay, great. But, yeah, we should get to that topic. But yeah, Max versus Lando plus Oscar is going to be a fight every single race. And when we get to races that we know Red Bull's historically not been good at, like the Singapore, like he's not going to win those races. Like we for sure know that we are going to get multiple different constructor winners throughout, and I think McLaren is setting themselves up to win the constructors title for sure
this year.
Yeah, I'm a believer. I think Sergio is washed, and he's going to get replaced before the year's over.
Well, I thought he had a 2-year deal that we thought was a 2-year deal, but it looked like it was a 1-year deal. You think they could sign themselves off of anything if they want to?
Yeah, there's a report that there is an option. There are some stipulations that by the summer break, Sergio has to be within 100 points of Max, and he has to be in the top 5. And he is neither of those right now.
Isn't that an awful thing? They're like, you need to be within 100 points of your teammate. Like other teams are looking around going, that's it? Like, come on, we don't even have 100 points as a team. Like half these teams are looking in. Speaking of teams scoring a lot of points that we didn't necessarily think they were going to get scored, underrated performance this past week by Nico Hülkenberg. I bring it up because it's obviously Haas, but man, the guy is just, I don't know what it is. And I mean, this is his second stint that I've seen in Formula One, right? Like, and so he wasn't anything special when he was racing for Renault, right? I've just been absolutely blown away by what he's been able to do. I mean, obviously that's why Sauber, Audi, wanted to sign this guy up, and I don't want to get totally away from the top finishers, but I mean, like, what a story that Haas is like in the 50s of points that they've scored already this year. It's crazy to see.
Yeah, it's awesome. What a stud. Like those, K-Mag isn't too far behind him, but Hülkenberg is out qualifying consistently the group in Formula A, the top half of the field. And you wonder if he's kind of regretting his decision to go to Sauber. I mean, he's going to a worse car next year for sure. And when he probably signed that deal, he thought like, oh, this is a sideways step, but he's going to be taking a step back and hoping that in 2026 that, it ends up turning out for him. And he's not the only one that's probably rethinking his contract decisions. Like Lewis, do you want to be Lewis right now going to Ferrari and leaving Mercedes that's surging?
Well, that's the whole thing is like he and it was looking like the smart move at the beginning of the year. It was, wow, how is he able to predict that these other teams are going to be, that Mercedes isn't going to be able to pull it off, and that Ferrari is kind of like, well, and here's the other thing that's hard. They're going off of what because the 2026 regulations are really, I mean, next year might be whatever it is. They'll be able to explain that away and say, well, the 2026 car that we're developing, and who knows what the reality is on that, where everybody's going to be. Yeah. So in the end, you take the 9 figures that Ferrari gives you, and no one's going to really, but the reality is that whatever happens with Lewis, we got our story tale ending last week, of course, winning at Silverstone. That was the one that the Hollywood writers approached Max Verstappen with and said, would you be okay if we finish the race like this, right? No, it was just a phenomenal finish. I think that to do it in front of the British crowd, to do it for the 9th record winning time at one single circuit, I'm trying to think of all the things that he did. I mean, he might not get that shot ever again with Mercedes. The guy was crying uncontrollably. He talked about how much he owes, Mercedes and everything, and he took a calculated gamble to go to the biggest name in racing ever, in F1 racing ever, which isn't a bad move from a financial standpoint. But I don't know. I've told you, I have fallen less and less in love with Toto Wolff's way of doing things. It just is so. And I went back and actually watched a handful of Drive to Survive episodes this past when I was just on my most recent flight I was on for work. And I watched the one where he and Susie are talking about, developing and what that contract negotiation is going to be like with Lewis. And what's funny is that whole episode goes and ends without the actual reality of what went down, which was then by January, even though he signed a quote unquote 2-year deal, he ended up signing with Ferrari to be with them for next year. And so it's a weird, wild world, and it's a weird sport, but Toto's becoming one of those grumpy, unlikable characters now.
Yeah, I'm glad that when Lewis crossed the finish line, it was George on the radio to congratulate him first. I thought that was kind of neat, even though, it sucks that George DNF'd and that he was in that position to do it. But that was, I became more of a Lewis fan this last weekend than I ever had before. I've always kind of been so-so on him. But it's a great story. It's undeniably a great story. And it was an awesome race, start to finish. Like, if you don't like that, like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, that's Formula One at its best. Iffy conditions, changing conditions, change in lead. It was a nail biter down to the very end. And to see Lewis, it seems almost too scripted that it came at the British Grand Prix. But if you're Lewis, you might also be thinking, like, is this my last win ever? Like, you better appreciate the moment, because Ferrari kind of sucks right now, and who knows? So you gotta. I'm sure at that point in his career that he has to think, like, this might be the last one, and so it's super meaningful, and it was cool to see the emotion from him and the team. But yeah, they totally flubbed it. I think, and a lot of people, but I personally would have liked to have seen Lewis retire at Mercedes and just been kind of a career Mercedes driver.
Yeah. It's a combination, I think, of liking the limelight, also being massively competitive. You can't be the best at your sport, without being that insane Tom Brady, insatiable, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant kind of almost jerk-like, approach to the sport. In terms of competitiveness, I've learned to just be like a lot more respectful is not the word, I guess. Just like, but I look at those guys and go, you know what? Tip your cap to you guys, because you have way more competitive drive than anyone on the planet. It's got to be a 0.00000001% of the population with that competitiveness, and then you pair it with the talent that they have, and that's how you get what you get when with those types of guys. So let's chat about people who have a little less talent, though. Checo Perez. You talked a little bit about the contract possibilities there, but can you explain anything else for the falling off? I can't explain, because he was right there with Max in the same car. Not right there. I mean, he was still getting beaten by 15, 20 seconds, but he can't even pull a second place or even a top 4 in that car. I don't understand what's fallen off with Checo. Was it the signing of the contract and feeling like he had, kind of gotten something and you didn't have to. It's like the guys going to the Live Tour in golf or something. You get your big payday and then you stop practicing or something.
Yeah, I would have thought that, like, you get the 2-year deal signed and it's like, okay, monkey's off my back. I can just race, the way I want to race. But if there was this, part of the contract, this term that said you got to catch up, close the distance to Max by the summer break or you're gone, then
right.
The pressure is 100% still there. So I could see that, causing issues. It seems like with him that his problems start on Friday. He's like, how many red flags has he brought out in practice? How many, that stuff that then carries into qualifying and puts him on the back foot going into Q1. And so it is persistent and pervasive. Like, every time he's on the track, it's not like bad luck. It's happened too many times to be bad luck. I think I don't know if it's some sort of like just phase that he's in. He's in a bad shooting streak and he's got to shoot his way out of it. Or if we know that everyone has closed the gap on Red Bull, and is it just showing that the Red Bull is a top 3 car, but if you've got a sub average driver, then you're going to average a 10th place finish. That is probably what it is at best. So
it's crazy.
They're saying it's Daniel Ricciardo is the most likely replacement. I'm not convinced that's a huge upgrade at this point in Daniel's career. I'd love to see him take a flyer on Yuki Tsunoda. I think he's, been the stronger driver from the Toro Rosso, the V-Carb, team this year. And he's got the youth and I think more of a, perspective future. But Red Bull loves Daniel, and to put him, side by side with Max in that car, I think would be their dream. And, where they stand, we should take a look at the constructor standings. So Red Bull 373, Ferrari still in second, 302.
Oh, wow.
McLaren catching fast at 295.
Mm-hmm.
So let's call it an 80-point difference between Red Bull and McLaren. And if you're not getting points finishes out of Sergio, that gap can close before the end of the year without having to believe a ton.
A lot of people speculating how long this contract could be between Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton. Fred Vasseur, the team principal for Ferrari, actually brought up a quote that everybody loves. I've never met more tinfoil hat sports conspiracy people in my entire life before I got into F1. But this quote from a Financial Times interview. I know it's your favorite paper to read, the Financial Times, where the Fred Vasseur. It says, Lewis is an important symbol because it sends positive messages to the paddock for the future of this team, said Fred Vasseur in the bright modern office in Maranello. I don't think we needed that tidbit, but fine. Near Bologna. He had to make the choice clear. Where do I have the biggest chance to win the world championship in 2025, 2026, and 2027? And Lewis said Ferrari. Okay. So, 3-year deal, maybe?
Years. Yeah.
For $180 million? Is that what the rumor was? Isn't that what the almost
it was 9 figures, yeah.
Almost $200 million? Or they do it in the or do they do it in the euros?
It's probably in euros, which is more in dollars.
Yeah. Well, if it's almost $200 million for 3 seasons, not a bad payday for he can cry himself to sleep with his money if he's not winning those races. But it's a weird thing that people take a gamble on the development of these 2026 cars. I don't know what data they're showing guys who they're negotiating with as we get into the silly season. I think that's part of the thing that happens, right? We start to get into this, and guys are guessing where they're going to be in a couple of years, and they're hoping that 2026, if you're Red Bull, you're terrified that you're going to be actually the 5th fastest team after everything's said and done in 2 years.
Yeah. It's all, speculation and smoke and mirrors at this point. If you're trying to pitch a driver on what advantage you already have they technically haven't, they're not allowed to have started, the 2026 development until I think January 1st of next year. So these people are just making bets, right? They're just taking chances. If you're Carlos Sainz, you still have the chance. He hasn't signed anywhere yet. That's the big signing that everyone's waiting on, and he hasn't signed yet. And you might end up at a place that, Ferrari's not going to stay down for too long, but maybe next year and the year after you might find, you're in a better spot than where you were. I think Carlos is getting a lot out of the car. They're saying that the recent drop in performance of Ferrari is due to the aero upgrades that they brought in Barcelona. No, not Barcelona. In the Spanish Grand Prix.
Yeah.
And that it's just it's like higher downforce, lower ride height, and that it's better for Carlos. And Charles is still having a hard time figuring it out. Who knows? But I think Carlos is showed to be the more consistent driver than Charles for sure. So Williams, I think Alpine and Mercedes are still kind of the 2 leading candidates, or the 3, the most likely spots that he lands.
Alpine actually has not looked terrible, have they?
They're improving for sure. Yeah.
I've definitely watched one of those episodes too that I rewatched, and I had forgotten because they're showing and now knowing what we know, and Esteban Ocon leaving the team, and Pierre Gasly and he not getting along at all, which we see that a lot. I feel like now with Esteban Ocon, I don't like hate him. I don't know what it is, but he becomes quite a hateable character when no one gets along with him. But the whole episode of the whole Esteban and Pierre kind of back and forth, and then they fired Otmar Snaffauer during that time too. So on that same episode, they show him getting let go, and it's brutal. It's brutal to watch because he's like, I thought I was a big part of when we were 4th place as a team. Like you can just hear him in that Otmar voice, like. But it definitely, after like their 2nd DNF in a row, he goes, "Don't worry about it. We'll come back when we'll come back strong." And you're like, I got to say more than "don't worry about it" after double DNFs on 2 consecutive weeks, the quadruple DNF. So yeah. All right. As we look forward to races, what are you looking forward to in the next few weeks here as the triple header? Now with the triple header in the rear view, we get a little bit of a break, and then what do you anticipate happens in this, in the next couple of races here?
Yeah, so we have the break this week, and then we go into a doubleheader right before the summer break. So Hungary and Belgium. I think these are going to be great races. Like last year, going into these races, we're like, oh man, Max is just going to run away with both
Right.
these wins, especially Belgium. Like he could literally drive Spa in his sleep and win, or like not in his sleep, with his eyes closed. He
I'm
could drive
convinced some
a
of these
lap,
guys
eyes
could.
closed.
I'm convinced some of
Yeah.
these guys could actually drive the circuits with their eyes closed. They've done them so many times.
But I think that knowing what the tracks that we've been at, it's going to be really good racing. So up front, it's going to be exciting. And then, I'm just going to keep watching what happens with Sergio and the V-carb drivers. And, I think that if anybody can, rip a driver out of their seat in the middle of the year, it's Red Bull, and they've done it before. I think the other thing too we haven't talked about is Ollie Berman got announced as the signing at Haas.
Yeah,
which good for him, but also that means one driver on the grid today will not be racing next year. There's only 20 seats, and we have a net new driver so either Kevin Magnussen's not getting a spot, or it's all going to shake out on the other end, and Logan Sargent gets knocked off the table. Like who knows? But we kind of now know for sure somebody has lost their job.
What's interesting is in other years, because I think K-Mag has 11 points in the championship. It's like if a Haas driver in the last 3 years had 11 points, he would be promoted to the lead Haas driver. And now, because you have 30 something points that his teammate has, and it's a wild time for to be a Haas fan, I guess. I don't know how long you can be a Haas fan. I don't know how much longer that's going to last, but. Yeah, I kind
of feel like Americans, we can just we're Haas fans when they're doing good.
Until Cadillac Andretti shows up, that's when we'll really all show up.
Yeah.
Or if there's ever a Ford Blue, that ends up on the grid, and it's not just in the back of a Red Bull, then maybe that would be the case. But yeah, it's harder. I don't know. I think K-Mag is going to be off the grid. That's my thought. I think you're going to see Logan Sargent gone. I think you're going to see K-Mag gone. I think Joe Guan Yu's only on that grid because of the money he brings in from a financial standpoint. Mm-hmm. Did they say Lance re-signed for a deal? Is that what the newest thing was?
Yeah. Like any of us are surprised,
how does that go? Under the dark of night. Yeah.
Yeah. Slap on the back. Like, good job, bud. Gosh.
From rags to riches. It's a classic story. It never gets old. It never gets old. All right, Dan, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the break for this week, and we'll get into more next week. Of course, we're going to preview the next Grand Prix, and then we'll get into a couple of more things, I would assume, over the next couple of weeks, because we've been totally off schedule when news has been breaking. We've been used to it being at certain times. It's a great time to be an F1 fan or if you love drama, because stuff will just start popping up whenever. I'm sure we're going to have stuff to break next week, too.
Yeah, it's time for me to quit my day job and just do this full time, man.
We're coming up on by the end of the season, we'll have our 100th episode under the belt, if you can believe
awesome.
It. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So for Dan Jimenez, Alex Curie, we'll be back again next week, breaking down more F1 for you and getting you ready for the rest of this season. So for Dan, I'm Alex. We'll see you next time, everybody.